Welcome to this week's Treasury Career Corner podcast, where I interview Treasury professionals about their Treasury careers. Each and every week, I talk to them about how they've built their careers, where they are now, where they see both themselves and the Treasury profession going to next. Let's get on with the show. This week's show, delighted to be joined by Rob Farrow, Corporate Treasurer at SABIC. SABIC is a global leader in chemicals, headquartered in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And they make from making cars and planes more fuel efficient to helping conserve the world's water supply, through to smartphone cases, all the way top to bottom. Massive global group. They've got more than 33,000 employees worldwide, operating in over 50 countries, and many global patents and the lot. Truly global. And I know a lot of this because I placed Rob in his role and a number of the other members of the team. So love recruiting for the group, and lots of things happening there as well. We'll get onto that later on in the show. But as always, known Rob for a number of years, so it's slightly not disingenuous, but I'm going to ask him to take us through his career. But I know all about it because we've been friends for years. But Rob, take us back, if you would, to the very, very dim, distant past, and how you first got started in finance and then discovered the world of Treasury. So, as always, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mike. Well, yeah, you have known me for a few years, but my career goes back even longer than that. So I suppose we start back in the days of university, doing a physical geography degree and really thinking about what I was going to do for a job. Long story, relatively short in that, was I ended up at Ford Credit after a full start with the civil service. And anyone who's ever done any time in the civil service will know exactly why I left there as soon as I could. Ford Credit, I actually joined as a marketing guy and spent several years in my very early career at Ford Credit. This was Ford Credit in the UK, doing marketing, business analysis roles, a bit of financial analysis and some credit. And then this is how life works, right? I used to play football, and the referee, this was just an internal football team, just a thing we did once a week. The referee was the treasurer. At the time, he was called the borrowing and banking manager. And you get talking. And I thought, I like the sound of what you do, Ken. His name was Ken. And we got talking, and he basically said, well, if you want to come in to join me, if I have a job come up, I'll let you know. And that's how I started. So my first treasury role actually was in 1987. Yes, I am that old. And experience, yeah. And really that sort of hooked me onto the treasury world, and it got me understanding very quickly, particularly of course in a credit company, the absolutely central role that Treasury has for a business. And Ford Credit was a really good example of that, because UK-based company, initially we had all our debt was sourced either from banks or from brokers. The old days when you used to go to a broking house and they would introduce a company with cash to Ford Credit who wanted the cash, and we'd take their money for 3 months or 6 months or however long. That was quite a good source of funds for us at the time. But during the period at Ford Credit, that evolved. And this is another area of Treasury which I've really enjoyed the years. Evolved into, okay, we're stuck with banks and we're stuck with deposits. What else can we get into? How can we diversify the funding? So we did several things over the next, I suppose, 5 or 6 years. We opened a commercial paper program. We went into the bond markets. We did Euro Sterling bonds through names that have long since disappeared, unfortunately, the likes of Hambros, Bearings, all these characters. And we also, and this was one of the really difficult things that came up relatively early in my career. Obviously, it wasn't just down to me, but we put together the first auto loan securitization in the UK. So a lot of different things going on. Also spent some time while I was doing that in the European arm, so Ford Credit Europe, which was also, and still is, I believe, based out of Brentwood in the UK. So I got to see places like Sweden, Finland, Spain, Germany, all the different Ford Credit affiliates around Europe, and also starting some local commercial paper programs, dealing with the banks. It's also the first time I got into risk management with interest rates, because Ford Credit domestically funded itself in local currency. So our risk management issues were more on the interest rate side. But again, we looked at our portfolio, we said we're borrowing too short. Hence, we went to the bond markets and we did a lot of of what we call term matching, really just matching the loan book that we had. You can imagine the average car buyer is taking maybe 3, maximum 5-year loan. So trying to match our maturities there with the debt book. So a lot of different things relatively early in the Treasury career. And as I said, that was really interesting. I loved it. Then, jogging along very nicely, I'd ended up at the end of those few years as the treasurer for Full Credit of the UK. Ken retired. I took the job from him, and then, I guess it was a couple of years later, I got tapped on the shoulder to move across to Ford, the Ford Motor Company. Completely and utterly different role. There I am as the treasurer of Full Credit in the UK, sterling-based. Didn't know an FX, didn't know how to spell FX, frankly. And then they put me in as the manager of foreign exchange for Ford of Europe, pre-Euro.
When you say they put you in as that, was that you going, yeah, I'll do it? Or was that them saying, well, you know us, you know this, and just throwing you in the deep end?
It was, it's a good question, Mike. It wasn't something I looked for. I was quite happy doing what I was doing. There's a bit of a theme here, which I'll talk about later on. But I was quite happy doing what I was doing. But they said, look, we want you to grow, that's what we'd say now, and develop. So they said, we want you to have a go at this. And you've got a good team already. So they put me literally across the road from the Ford Credit building into the Ford Motor Company building. Now I'm suddenly responsible for $60 billion a year of trading in FX. And I say pre-Euro, 45 different currencies. So what I had was a really strong group of people who are working for me and working with as peers. And what I learned from that, apart from anything else, is you've got to be very, what's the word I'm looking for? You've got to be very used to getting help and taking advice. If you're the person who's giving you the advice, put yourself, there's a really nice German guy who was head of the trading. I come in over his head, don't know one currency from another. He took it extremely positively. He was my trainer, didn't make any issues about it, and he's gone on to be extremely successful himself. But, that move across to doing something completely new is impossible if you don't have really good people around you. And I think looking back at the time, you're young and you just, okay, I can do that. But looking back, if I hadn't have had such a strong group of people around me, I would have completely failed, to be honest.
So just jumping in there, I've heard the opposite, where some people have come in that, they don't know what they don't know, but they're not willing to, they see that as a sign of weakness, that if they, but then, well, I don't really know what you're doing, but I'm the treasurer, we're going to do this, there is one that sticks in my mind. I can't say who, because they're a proper treasurer out there, but they came in and they said, right, we're going to do all this, and we need to do this in this specific country. And the current treasurer said, well, you can try, but actually it doesn't work like that. And, after a 3-month failed project, they sort of seemed to realise that a little bit. Said, actually, we decided we're not going to do that project. So it was actually, I said to him, what do you think they should have done? He said, literally, just come on in. Like I've heard, he'd heard a couple of our podcasts, and he said, I loved one of them, which was with Joel Campbell a few years ago. And it was a really great one because he said, his boss said, just come in. I don't want you to do anything for 3 months. He was like, what? You're paying me? He said, no, don't come in with big boots and try and change things. Just come in and learn, work with the people, get to know them, and then start to, see where you can make an impact. And it made a hell of a difference. It sounds like you had a similar thing, or
no one said that to me. Please don't do anything for 3 months.
No.
But another thing happened. Of course, this was exactly the time of the RM crisis.
Yeah.
So nobody had any time to really sort of think creatively about how to do things different for a few months anyway. We were crashing around dealing with that. But no, I think, look, there's, in my view, if you're taking a new role where you don't know anything about the job, obviously we all take new roles where we don't know a lot about the new business we're getting into. We have to learn. As you get later in your career, hopefully most of the jobs you take, at least something about to be dangerous. But this was completely different role. You can't go from a sterling only funding operation and cash management, but mainly debt management, to foreign exchange. It's completely different if you've never done it before. So it's anyone who could have gone in there with the ballsy approach to say, don't tell me what to do because I'll find out. That's not going to work. So no, I think having a very strong team there and moving people to learn into it with the support of that team, I would always say that is a best practice. To your point, Mike, after 6 months or however long it is, if you've got ideas to do things differently, which you do, then you can start talking about it and integrating it. But I think to learn the basics, particularly a very technical area like FX, these were the days before any FX platforms or anything like that. It was pick up the phone, direct lines into the dealing rooms, really, really different world. And you can't go in there without the right level of support from people. That's really something that I'm very strongly a believer in is using the expertise of the people that are around you, because it's very, very rare. In fact, I've never come across it, that you don't have very knowledgeable and good people, at least in a lot of your team. Every team is mixed, of course, but generally speaking, there's a very solid group of people. Sometimes they actually don't get noticed if they're not squeaky wheels, but there's a lot of very good people about. And if you take time to listen to them, then you learn a lot.
Yeah. And then moving from that role, you were then offered the role in Detroit, or a nice move, from you out in Essex. Oh, come on, off you go. You go to Detroit, please. How did that go down with the family?
Well, that was, this again, another happenstance. So that Ford moving the business, not the business, but the foreign exchange, the whole foreign exchange area, if you like, centralize it into Detroit. So yes, they started to talk to me about moving across. Now, at that time, always lived in Essex. Family was very young. Wife with a very successful physiotherapy career. And we thought, it's a bit daunting. And this moves on to the next step, I suppose. But Dave Rosati, who was the head of FX at GE, got wind of Ford moving their foreign exchange operation, needed somebody to do foreign exchange for GE in Europe. And again, I was tapped on the shoulder saying, how about moving to GE? Because they thought, you might not want to go to Detroit. And they were right. So that's how I ended up going across to GE, somebody who these days you'd find out from LinkedIn or whatever, but having contacts in the market then, they picked up on the fact that my job was going to be relocated, and so I got the tap on the shoulder.
And what was GE like then? And I say this in a loaded question way, because you and I both know I did a lot of recruitment for GE at the time, and then GE Capital. GE Capital overtook GE as a firm, and then suddenly, in later years changed. We are industrial services and everything else. We're in industry again. But at that time, what was the state of GE, and how did that then, I know that then affected your next couple of moves there, because you were with GE for a number of years?
It was very different. Unfortunately, a lot of not so good stuff has happened to GE in the last few years. But at the time, it was a machine. Most of my company, all that stuff. Mind you, we used to look at each other and say sometimes, God, what's it like working for the second most of my company? But it was a Welsh era, and in fact it was a very dynamic and very good company, frankly, to work for. And what they were doing was centralizing a lot of the foreign exchange and later on cash management operations from the different business units in Europe. When I joined, I went from the Ford dealing room with a whole bunch of telephones, direct lines to banks and traders, to a desk with a phone. And the job was, we've got all these guys doing their own foreign exchange out there in plastics, medical systems, Nova Pignoni, wherever it was. We want you to bring it all into corporate. Here's a list of names of the finance managers. Go do it. And of course, that's you have to start working on that. You have to convince yourself and then the people you're talking to why it's a good idea. And we built up that relationship and gradually brought the trading in-house. So that took some time. And again, it was one of those periods I look back on and think it was pretty heavy lifting to get people on side to do it. But it is one of the biggest challenges that I've had that convinced me of the lesson I hope I've learned, which is unless you can tell people, believe it yourself and get them to understand why you're doing something, you'll never have a prayer of doing it properly.
Yeah.
So it was building the business case for people. Why are we taking away all this fun stuff that you're doing out of Bergen op Zoom in the Netherlands and bringing it into Hammersmith? So very credible reasons to do it in terms of critical mass and risk management, managing the bank, the bank relationships and the limits that we had with the banks better and so on. But it took some time. But that was, again, that was a blast. We got it up and running. In fact, this is I don't think even you know this one, Mike. We ended up buying all the direct dealing phones from Ford and took them into our office in GE because they were moving to Detroit. So we got them for a song, and then we had all our direct lines out to GE. But that was the sort of, I suppose, the first couple of years of my tenure in GE. And we did a lot. As I say, we centralized all the trading. We put a really neat tax structure together. I didn't, but working with the tax team, which GE was legendary at the time for having these really, really smart tax people. And we put together some really tax efficient funding structures, working with the banks and to make sure the funds flows in billions of dollars, the funds flows would work without getting hung up in the markets or blowing through limits. So a lot of fun. Then Euro was being talked about, and we had to think about how we were preparing for the Euro introduction. So I was head of that team as well. So a lot of fun there in London. And then GE decided that I'd had enough fun there after 3 or 4 years. Could you go and do the same for us in Asia, please? And this was the time when moved on a bit. Family had grown up a bit, and we decided, you know what, it's not a bad idea.
Yeah.
Let's go for it. Let's try Asia. So we went out there, looked at Hong Kong or Singapore to be based in, but Singapore was the decision. And, again, introduced a lot of the same things for Asia, but the Asia currency crisis happened. So my phone and the desk where I was calling people suddenly became a phone I was answering a lot. With all the business people in Asia saying, what the hell's going on? And suddenly Treasury became the center of the universe for GE in Asia. And it was no bad thing. And I think the one thing I have learned a lot, going back, as I said, to that ERN crisis in Ford, and going then to this Asia crisis and so on into other crises we've had right through to now with COVID, is that's the time that people really sit up and proactively want to get hold of you and get your help. And you become an absolutely critical cog in the risk management for a company. You always are, but sometimes people don't realize it as starkly as when you've got a crisis going on. So that was, in fact, a blast. I had a lot of support from the corporate audit staff in terms of drilling down into the exposures that we had and so on and so forth. But it was fun times in Asia with the crisis going on. Everybody wants to be your friend. And then same time, or not same time, just after that, I don't know if you remember, but GE and Honeywell were meant to get together.
Yes.
And I was leading up the integration team for Asia for that. I'd really been involved in any kind of M&A activity, but I learned a lot from that, and that's come back to be extremely helpful in later life as well. So, that was good. And I suppose as a reflection on career building, it's something I've just thought of while I've been talking about this era. Don't be afraid to stick your head out and say, I'd like to be involved in that, even if it's not in your remit or you don't think it's in your job description. If you're at the other side of that, and I've had many people working for me who have done the same thing, when you show some enthusiasm, some real sort of inquisitiveness about how things are going, I'd like to know some more about that. It really does work because A, it's interesting for yourself, and secondly, people who are hiring internally or externally, I don't know how you feel about this, Mike, but when you've got somebody who comes to you with enthusiasm and that inquisitiveness, and you can see that they've done things outside of their own box, it really counts for a lot in my book.
Because it just shows an ethos, an attitude, and I don't think enough people. That's one of the things when I've recruited for you guys, when I've recruited for other clients, the people will say to me, "Well, what do you think?" Well, I say, and I'll give my opinion. It won't be a technical opinion about. I'm not going to sit there and assess, whether they, their level of cash management expertise or various other bits, because I've got treasurers who are far better than that. But what I will do is, what's their ethos? Are they prepared to get stuck in when everything, when, as you say, when there's an economic currency crisis, are they going to be the ones getting stuck in and going, right, I can help. What can I do? I don't know what to do, but just tell me where to pick up the phone, because those are the people you want to have on your team.
Yeah. So, I'll just probably spend a bit too long talking about the G stuff, but certainly Asia and that crisis is an area I did learn a great deal. And I say with the stuff going on with the Honeywell it never happened. Then I spent a couple of years in Norway, did a CFO job in a very small piece of the GE power empire with GE Hydro. So again, it was a job that I had no previous qualifications or experience in, not for a lot of it anyway. Obviously the treasury part and some of the M&A, but a lot of the general financial management didn't have that experience. I had some very good people again who guided me through it. Unfortunately, the business itself was shocking. It was something that GE sort of decided to buy without really, frankly, doing some magnificent due diligence. It wasn't a great success as a business. A couple of years there, I did learn an awful lot, but the business itself never made any money. And then I ended up coming out of that after 2 or 3 years, back to the core treasury area in the US. So I became the sort of treasurer for the whole of the infrastructure business, as they called it then. Water, power, rail, all that kind of stuff. Again, a lot of very interesting things there, a lot of M&A activity. Bentley Nevada was acquired, Panametric. There's a small company in Austria, Jenbacher, is involved in a lot of those. And a lot of also real compliance type of activities. And this is another area that is sometimes overlooked, I think, with Treasury. It's the interface between Treasury and the accounting groups, controllership. This was the time when the whole FAS 133 stuff blew up at GE, and the mismatch of some of the borrowing and some of the risk management tools, the swaps and everything that were taken, was causing a lot of noise in the GE P&L. So we had to do a real global scrub of all our FAS 133 documentation activities, which landed on me. Now, am I naturally a controller or an accountant? No, I'm not. But this was very illuminating. And in fact, it's, again, knowledge that has come back to be useful since. FAS 133, of course, has moved on into other areas, but the principles are still there. So making sure that what we're doing in risk management and funding actually works in terms of the accounting is another thing not to be, I suppose, underlooked in terms of Treasury. That was a good experience in that sense. Then again, what happens after a few years at GE? You think about what's next. There I was as the treasurer for the infrastructure group and wondering what to do in terms of career. And again, I got approached. Completely different sort of role in Kuwait in the Gulf. And the role there was whole corporate treasurer for the whole business. Something I'd never done. I'd been a CFO for a very small piece of GE. I'd been treasurer for big pieces of GE, big pieces of Ford, been a specialist here and there, but never done the whole caboodle. So very appealing. So I moved to Kuwait, Alghanim Industries, family-run business, couple of $1 billion turnover, but all sorts of different business, anything from car dealership through to steel building, manufacturing, advertising agencies, and Costa Coffee. So a whole range of different businesses. I say, it had the whole thing.
Sorry, just to jump in there, you'd gone from GE to Alghanim, but also, we'd had their Far East, so Singapore, through Oslo, through, Bracknell and Atlanta, but to Kuwait, because at that time, what was it like there? What was, because this was, great experience of the Middle East and stuff. Can you describe that for us?
Kuwait's a quiet place. That's the best way I can describe it. It's very, very compact. There's a very small Western expat community in Kuwait. It's not like the Emirates, but it's a very self-contained place in terms of its business activity. And the Alghanim family, there's 2 branches of the Alghanim family, and between them, they control a lot of the private business in Kuwait. What we found living there, if I'm not talking about the job now, but living there is a very straightforward place to live. Not a lot to do unless you fly somewhere else, but a very tight expat community. And actually for my wife and myself, that worked very well. By this time, by the way, the kids are old enough to be off and doing their own thing. So we didn't have family with us. It's a perfectly easy place to live. The job, again, was very different in terms of having the whole gamut. And I also had responsibility for credit insurance in terms of P&L. So we actually offered car insurance and collections. So collections on the credit side, that all came under this job. So it was a bit back to the future in terms of what I originally did at Full Credit with some of that. So again, lesson learned is even stuff that you do donkeys years ago can come back to be useful in experience when you take on new jobs. New stuff there, Islamic finance. Never come across that before in my life. But we ended up doing a Sukuk, which is an Islamic-based bond. It was the first one that we did there out of Alghanim, and it was, again, learnt a lot on how to structure these things. And we did a lot of JV management. In Turkey, we got a JV. We're building a new plant in Saudi Arabia with our partners at Saint-Gobain, getting funding from SIDF in Saudi for that. And really dealing with a very diverse team. Obviously, I've had diversity in teams before in terms of men, women, but not so much on the ethnic side, to be honest. Singapore, we had a lot of locals, but not the type of mix that we came across in Kuwait, because not only do you have Western, you have South Asian expats, you have obviously Asian expats, you've got locals, very diverse team. So that was very interesting and a very good management experience or leadership experience, for want of a better word, how to deal with different cultures. So you think you move to Kuwait and you're going to be dealing with an Arabic culture. You're not really. That's a piece of the pie. You're dealing with a South Asian culture. You're dealing with a Middle Eastern, Lebanese, Egyptian culture. You're dealing with a Filipino culture, all in this melting pot of the Treasury team in Alghanim. So very interesting to actually manage that kind of diversity.
And you did Kuwait for what? You were there for 6 years, so did that successfully. What then led to you then moving? What happened next?
Well, what happened next was my boss in Kuwait left before I did, and he moved to Itron. So after we'd done 6 years in Kuwait, thought it was time for a change. Now, there's nowhere else to go in terms of the job in Kuwait. So learned a lot, done a fair bit, and we thought, what's next? And again, he said, when you are going to leave, let me know. And I did, and he said, I need a treasury guy. So that was it. I interviewed with obviously some of the HR people and the CEO of Itron, and then they moved me across to Liberty Lake, which, for those of you who don't know, Washington State is the West Coast. Seattle is the most famous piece of that. If you go right to the other end, more or less the Idaho border, there is Spokane and Liberty Lake, and anyone who follows college basketball will have heard of the Zag, and they are based in Spokane, Washington. So again, completely different area, completely different business, smart meters, communications. But now I would say this, Mike, if I'm thinking about all these different jobs, the issues are the same. Sometimes the noughts you add on to the end are more or less. But if you're trading FX, if you're running risk management, if you're trying to match your exposures, the issues are the same. If you're trying to borrow really efficiently, the issues are the same. The numbers may be bigger or smaller, but they're the same. So there we are in Itron, same sort of issues. It's a global company, more or less the same size as Alghanim, but with a lot more complexity in terms of its footprint. M&A comes through again. We bought a company in Ireland, had a very big deal with Silver Spring, which was an acquisition of a company about a third of the size of Itron. So a lot of M&A activity. And then right towards the end of that, also the COVID nonsense hit, the next crisis. So again, protecting the balance sheet, making sure that the rating agencies understood what Itron's doing, keeping everybody calm, frankly, and saying, no, we're not going to run out of money. It's fine. Look, the customers are still paying. Introducing processes so that people can see on a daily basis how our collections are going and how our payables are going and so on. So a lot of that you wouldn't think is necessarily treasury, but boy, it has to be when you've got that sort of crisis going on. You have to step in and say, I need to understand this, and this is what we're going to do.
Just briefly, Rob, I don't know whether we really explain to the listeners what Itron does, and how that then affects treasury, just so that we get background to that. So
Itron is it's a manufacturer of meters. It does that in Europe. It does that in the US, but mainly it's raison d'etre is smart communications and facilitating the way that your meter at home will communicate with the other meters around it and also with the utility. So that anything from billing to outages to leaks, whether it's gas, electricity, water, a combination of sensors and communications is what Itron's all about. So when you've got a big infrastructure spend, then the company does very well, like they did in 2010, 2011 after the 2008 crisis. Yeah. But at the same time, it's cutting-edge technology, and sometimes that doesn't work so well straight out the box. So you have to manage issues around customers sort of not paying because the stuff isn't working. You have other issues around your supply chain, which I'm sure, obviously I haven't been in the company for a while now, a lot of these things rely on chips. And when I was there a couple of years ago, we had problems with supply chain on chips. So it's a small company in that game. You're up against the General Motors and the Apples of the world. You're not necessarily at the top of the pecking order with the chip manufacturers.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of issues for a company like Itron. Managing the supply chain. I know, again, not my job, but working to make sure that we had the right availability of cash for the right, expediting that we might have to do for certain customers or things like that. So, and a double B company. So we issued a bond with that, which was actually very successful, a double B rating. Lots of interesting things. Again, I don't want to take up the whole podcast telling stuff about what we did and what we didn't do.
I think it's important because it gives a practical sense. People are listening to today's episode, they know that you're a treasurer that's done infrastructure, you've done widgets, although they're smart meter widgets, but you've done practical things, and I think that's key because exactly as you said throughout your career, you've got so many different areas. You've seen it from cars industry. That makes it that strength about yourself, I think, treasury terms, because then, and exactly as you say, from Itron and Washington State, you spoke to this weird treasury recruiter. Oh, that's me, and said, "Look, I've got this amazing role. Can you then maybe fill in the blanks for me?" Come on, I know the blanks, by the way, listeners, but over to you.
Yeah. So. Itron, it goes back. I said there'd be a bit of a theme at the start of my spiel. Perfectly happy doing what I was in Itron. So it was a very good company to work for. But then you get an opportunity to be the treasurer for a $35, $40 billion company, massive, completely different business, completely different footprint, if you like, in terms of the risk management. You compare a cracker, which is what we make the chemicals out of. These are hundreds of millions of dollars a piece. And when you have a company with massive growth ambitions like that is going through, frankly, a very, very tight and intense change management process now for finance, it's challenging but really appealing at the same time. So you think, I want to give that a shot. I've got experience of doing treasury pointy-headed activities. I've got experience of working in different companies in different markets. Coming into this job, what do I know about cracking chemicals to make plastics and agri-nutrients? Absolutely nothing. But that's the thing. You learn. I'm still learning. The curve is still very steep here. I've been here just over a year, but having that, bringing that together in terms of what you've learned yourself in different jobs and roles over the years to a completely different environment is one of the appeals of working, in my view. And you learn, you help people to learn because of your own experience. But if you're not actually picking up new stuff and taking on new things, you get very stale. And that's the name of the game for me, even at my age, is taking on new stuff and trying to marry up what you've learned with what you are going to learn. That's part of the appeal.
So one of the things we should mention here, Rob, is that you've got this global team. And I think it's remiss of me if I didn't, touch upon the scope of your role. And that's one of the key things, having recruited you guys for a number of years now, it's been head spinning at times. This is probably the first big global campaign. You've recruited for you guys in Saudi Arabia, through Netherlands, through to Texas, and back again, right the way around.
Yep.
And actually, it's stretched me as a recruiter, and I've learned more. Now, for you as a treasurer, okay, you'd had all these different global experiences, but what's it been like for you on that global aspect and running global teams? What would you sort of, give as inspiration or sort of words of advice to people out there listening today?
Yeah, if I may, Mike, I'm going to take that into two different
Go for it.
Thoughts, okay? Because using the SABIC experience, frankly, is not normal. And when I say not normal, we had to deal with bloody COVID all the time. So if you ask me a question about how would I have dealt with the global teams and everything in SABIC, in a time when COVID wasn't an issue, I'd have said, get on your bike, go and meet people, sit with them, understand how their piece of the team works and ticks and gels together. And this is what I did before in other global roles. Now, in Itron, most of the team was in Liberty Lake, but we had people in Austin, Texas. We had people in Paris. We had folks in Latin America. Obviously, in G, we had people all over the place. So that would be in a normal world what I'd say I would do as quickly as possible. Now, I haven't been able to do that in SABIC. So what we try and do is to get people together virtually, of course. We have monthly global Treasury town halls, which is not easy when you have to get people up early in Houston and tell them to stay up a bit late in Singapore. That's the only way you can do it. But actually doing that so that people are hearing directly what the team is doing, wherever you're sitting, that's important to me. But actually dealing with a global team, say in Alghanim, I had a global team in one place. That, again, it helps you to understand the different drivers of different cultures. And you always try and retain that knowledge and think, how should I respond to that? How should I think through somebody else's lens on this? So, I think having a global team in SABIC is clearly something that's going to continue. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to meet anybody yet, not in person.
Yeah, and that's key as well, isn't it? This meeting people, networking, but actually looking them in the eyes and then getting to know them. And I think it will change. And I'm, very much looking forward in 2022, heading, across the Atlantic to meet people in the US, meeting people across Europe and right the way around. But, but I think one thing it's given us is maybe, I don't know, more, I would say for me on a personal level, more respect for travel, in a way that I used to sometimes just get on a plane, did 13 conferences at one stage the year before, a couple of years before COVID. And actually that now it's given me a reason to think, right, this is why I do this. And these are the reasons. So, be less travel, but make more of it when you're there. As it comes back, what are you thinking that, is it, because obviously that in-person sort of, one-to-one is key to yourself. How are you going to make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, we do it with good old Skype calls on a one-to-one basis and smaller teams and everything else. But as soon as we have the opportunity, whether it's myself or my team, to be able to travel, sit down, understand people's strengths, development needs much more clearly as you're sitting in the same place, you can do it remotely. Of course you can. We've had to. But in my view, there isn't a substitute. If you're going to build and maintain and grow really strong teams, they've got to know who you are and you've got to know who they are. And that way you build the respect and rapport and get the best out of people. There's no substitute for it. And unfortunately, we obviously haven't had that opportunity for a year or two.
Yeah.
So it's a shame, but I'm looking forward to be able to do that again. And until then communication is key, and you have to do it by phone. And it's not ideal, but that's the way to obviously keep the momentum going. And
so, Rob, we've sort of discussed a lot about your career. Before the show, you and I sort of talked about a couple of sessions you've done recently. One of them was about reflecting on these number of years, amazing years you've had within Treasury and the changes, 30 years plus of Treasury experience and what it was like then to now. We've talked about a fax machine and my 10-year-old going, "What's a fax machine, Dad?" And I'm like, "Yeah, move on." Just not knowing. With yourself, what would you say have been the biggest shifts or changes, in your time, if you reflect over that time and reflect backwards, if you like, to up to then to now, sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious ones are things like trading, foreign exchange trading. Those banks of phones and talking to Martin Pilcher at NatWest on one, and somebody else at HSBC on another one, and getting the bids, and someone saying for the first time choice price, and you're thinking, What's that mean? And then figuring all that out into a trading platform now. So you've got FX all and the banks contribute, boom, you're done. Big differences in technology, and that's obvious. I think what I've noticed, and I think this is a factor of two things, Mike. One being, experience as you get older, maybe you do more of this. But secondly, the crises that we've gone through. I genuinely think that Treasury now has more of a voice and a seat at the table with the boards. I know it happened. I'm sure it happened in all my other companies with senior people. But if you're able to ask people who were, treasurers, assistant treasurers at Ford or GE back in the day and ask them now, I think the influence and the seat at the table that we have around capital allocation and around macro risk management has got a lot stronger. So what are we doing here in terms of capital expenditure versus M&A? How are we going to think about our next funding? Is that going to be in terms of public debt, or do we want to go to the markets or the bank? If we are going to decide to spend cash on this company versus paying a higher dividend, those kind of board level decisions, I think if you had some way of analysing this, I'm sure you'd see Treasury globally having more of a seat at the table at that. Remember what my first boss was called. He was called Borrowing and Banking Manager.
Yeah.
That was the status of Treasury back in the day. Now, and again, I can't prove this, it's just my sense that it's become much more strategic. Is it strategic enough? Maybe not, but it's certainly moved a long way in that direction. I think that's one of the biggest differences. Otherwise, I think, unfortunately, in many ways, the entry now for a lot of companies into Treasury, the way in, there's, HR policies can determine that you need finance degrees or MBAs or something else. I'd never have got there.
Yeah.
I don't think myself that that's as critical as that inquisitive mind and general sort of be able to get things done. But it's a fact of life now. And I think that's a bit of a shame. But that's a change. I wouldn't get HR to give me any credence now saying, doesn't matter if, he's got a geography degree, that's fine. He'll be fine in Treasury. That's a very difficult putt now with HR policies globally. So I think that's another change in terms of people wanting to get into the career, which is, again, a bit of a shame, obviously, from my perspective.
You're right. With that greater focus, with that greater spotlight, people understanding a lot more about Treasury itself, I think there comes that as well. People have sort of said to me sometimes, I want to get a new job, but I can only do 30% of the new job, 70% I'll learn. I said, well, that's fine for you, but I've got people that already know 70-80% of the job.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, I can still apply. I said, well, you can, but you won't get the job, because, and it's not a criticism of them per se. It's more, that employers, because Treasury, is much more in the spotlight. People understand what Treasury does, which is a good thing. It means that, there's greater pressure, and there's, Treasury departments are lean and mean by their very nature. So it just means that it's a fact that you need to go choose your next moves for, where you can do 60-70% and learn some and broaden yourself, as you've done very successfully throughout your career. I see, but I share your pain, sort of thing.
Yeah, at least now, and this is a positive, Mike. As you were talking, then at least now we have qualifications that people can get, which are Treasury based. They weren't around back in the day.
Yeah.
So whether you're looking at the AFP stuff, which I'm not a great fan of, but it's there in the US, or the ACT training that you can do, those are very useful and very good, in my view, tools for people who want to get into the career and progress. They weren't around.
Yeah.
So I think those type of qualifications now, which you don't have to do before you start, but you can do on the job. You certainly, for people like me, I would notice those qualifications a lot more stronger than an MBA or certainly a more general finance qualification.
I agree. And I had conversations with candidates and they've asked me, should I do an MBA or should I do the CFA, and should I do this CPA? Should I do this? Should I do? I'm like, well, it depends on you. I said, what do you want to do? What's going to add most value to you in your next role? And they're like, oh, okay. I said, yeah, think about that rather than think about your direction, not just getting another bit of paper on CV, as it were. That's a resume. Okay. So as we wrap up today's show, we'll put your LinkedIn details in the show notes so that people can look at you and say, do you know what? I want to be like Rob. And
there's no one that mad.
No, exactly. Broke that mold. But aside from that, if they do look at your background and say, do you know what? What are the recommendations you would make to them? Maybe if they're earlier in their career or mid-level or more senior, maybe some, final closing words of advice for the listeners today that you think that they should focus on or not focus on. Over to you.
I'll go back to the enthusiasm and the inquisitiveness, mate. That takes you a very long way. And if you're in a relatively junior role and you see an opportunity, it can come at you from left field, as the Americans would say, but a project that's going on, something that you say, yeah, I want to learn about that. Put your hand up, put yourself forward for it. You'll learn, and you get noticed by doing that. So that's one thing I'd say. And the other thing, again, it harks back to what I was saying earlier in my own experience, is get the best out of people. Once you move up through the career, you'll become more and more, probably, it's more and more about managing people than actually being technically proficient. But don't ignore the quiet people. I think it's easy, if you've got a big team particularly, that you've got the noisy ones, the ones who do put their hands up and everything else. And sometimes you find that some of the real wisdom is not there. It's with people who may have been around for a few years, may have been quiet, may have been overlooked almost. And if you engage with them, you're going to find out one of two things. You're going to find out either that they've been ignored because they've not been doing anything and you need to do something about that, or they've actually got a fount of knowledge and no one's asked them about it. And if you engage them, you find that you get real, I would say, nuggets of silver and gold and diamonds out of it. So don't assume. This is something that I've learned myself. Don't assume that somebody tells you, oh, so-and-so is no good because they don't say anything or do anything. It's not necessarily true. If it is true, shame on the people who told you that, because they should have done something about it themselves. And that's the only other thing I'd say for people who are later in the career, if you like. Deal with things. Don't let them fester. That's an easy thing to do, but it does nobody any favours. And I've learned that myself.
Amazing. Look, I love that one. I mean, I've phrased it here as listen to the non-talkers.
Yeah.
Listen out for them, and as you say, that's where the riches are. If you like, those people will have amazing stuff to contribute. So,
yeah, and if they don't, you'll find out, and you've got to do something else about it.
Yeah, exactly, and take action. Mr. Farrow, amazing today. Put your LinkedIn details in the show notes. As you say, can't wait to see you again in real life. We managed to catch up in between lockdowns and things like that briefly, but we'll do it again. Can't wait for the next time. But, again, people connect to Rob on LinkedIn. You'll see all his details there. Great person to have in your network, and look forward to seeing you soon, sir.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Hello, it's Mike here again. I hope you enjoyed this week's show. If you did, then maybe you want to follow the show or subscribe, depending on where you listen, whether that's iTunes, Spotify, or another great place to listen to the show from. It's totally free and means that you'll be the first to see each and every week when we release a new show. And maybe whilst you're there, you could even leave a quick review. Reviews and ratings are among the most important metrics for a podcast to effectively rank. And as you can probably appreciate, the podcast is a lot of hard work to produce every week. It'd be amazing. Just take, say, 20 seconds, leave a quick review of my amazing guests and their great career stories. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks very much, and I can't wait to see you soon.